Good morning, I'm Chris Teutsch, Forage Extension Specialist at the University of Kentucky's Research and Education Center in Princeton, and this morning I'm going to be talking to you about assessing and repairing pugged up pastures. As you would expect, the damage is always going to be most severe closest to hay feeding areas. So a lot of times when we're driving by in the truck and we're looking at our pastures, we look at these hay feeding areas and we have this knee-jerk reaction that we've just destroyed our entire pastures. But really, if you get away from these hay feeding areas, often the damage isn't quite as bad as we think on the majority of the pasture area. And that's kind of what I want to talk about first, is how do we quantify this damage. And the first thing we want to look at is the percentage of disturbance. And we can do that by laying a quadrat down. And we do this at multiple places within our pasture, and then kind of figuring out how much of that quadrat is disturbed. So in this example, it's probably around 20% would be disturbed in this particular example. The other thing that we look at is how deep that disturbance is. Is it an inch or is it 4 inches? In the depth of the pugging impacts how severe that damage is. And then we can kind of put it into this table. And what this table does is it helps us avoid making a knee-jerk reaction to that damage right around that hay feeding area. And we look at the percentage of damage here on the top, and then we look at the depth of pugging here on the first column. And then when we do that, we can kind of put this damage into one of these three categories of light, moderate, or severe damage. And then we can use that information to make management decisions. And I made this flow chart up a couple years ago, and what it does is it assesses damage. We assess damage first, like we talked about previously, and then we put it in one of these categories of light, moderate, or severe. And then we kind of follow that flow chart down for each category, and we give tips on what we can do to renovate pastures when we fall within one of these three categories. And that's kind of what I want to talk about for the rest of this presentation, is give you an example of light damage, moderate damage, and severe damage. So let's start out with light damage to very light damage. And in this example, we have 20 to 25% soil disturbance. And our pugging damage is fairly shallow, so 1 to 2 inches. And when we look at those two pieces of data, the amount of disturbance and the pugging damage, that's going to put us in this light to very light category. And then we move from there and we talk about things that we do to renovate this pasture that has light damage. And a lot of times when we have light damage, we don't have to do a whole lot to the pasture. We always want to make sure that our soil fertility and pH are right, in the right range, and that removes that additional stress and allows that pasture to grow. And then we just kind of need to rest and let our pastures recover in the spring. So light grazing, don't start to graze too early on these areas. One thing that we can do is frost seed clover, and that's going to add legumes back to that stand, and we can take advantage of those disturbed areas to get the clover started. And then we just want to graze lightly, that especially in early spring and as we move into summer. So just give those pastures a little tender loving care, lay off them a little bit, and let them recover. Just want to mention frost seeding clover real quick, and most of you know frost seeding is simply broadcasting clover on the soil surface, and we do this in late winter or very early spring when we still have freezing and thawing events occurring, and that freezing and thawing causes the soil to heave and little cracks to form in that soil and incorporate that seed into the soil. This works best with red and white clover. Not so well with alfalfa and grasses. We can seed 6 to 8 pounds of red clover and 1 to 2 pounds of ladino clover on these pastures that have been with light disturbance. And we can also add 10 to 15 pounds of annual lespedeza on lower fertility pastures. sometimes we'll be renting a farm and we don't have a long-term lease and we can't afford to spend a lot of money on lime and fertilizer for fear of losing that farm. So adding a little bit of annual Espediza, which is much more tolerant to those lower fertility conditions, can be beneficial. Just a couple things to think about in terms of having success with your frost seeding. You want to graze that pasture close prior to frost seeding. The only time I'll tell you to abuse your pasture is when you're getting ready to frost seed. We want to get the seed on early enough to ensure that we have adequate freezing and thawing cycles, and that's about 2 weeks prior to when we would expect not to get any more freezing and thawing cycles. I tell people to try to get it on by about mid-February, and then that guarantees that we've got plenty of freezing and thawing cycles to get that seed incorporated. We want to control competition from the existing sod after seeding. We want to make sure that we use a high-quality seed source and then use the correct seeding rate. So make sure and calibrate your seeders, and that's easier said than done with most of these small spinner-type seeders that you would put on the back of an ATV. It's hard to catch that seed, and it's hard to adjust them accurately. So it can be a little bit of a challenge. And then make sure you get even seed distribution. And using a small portable GPS unit or an app on your phone can really help get even seed distribution within the grazing system. This is just a nice publication that we have. It's called Frost Seeding Clover, a Recipe for Success. And it kind of goes through some of those tips that I just gave you that will enhance your success with frost seeding. You can reach it by just simply Googling Frost Seeding Clover, a Recipe for Success, or scanning this QR code, and it'll take you right to this publication. Just want to share a little bit of data with you, a couple frost seeding studies that we did. And the first one was using GPS to improve the accuracy of frost seeding. So the objective was to evaluate the impact of using GPS guidance on the uniformity of seed distribution during frost seeding. So what we did was we installed this small GPS unit. This happens to be a Raven Cruiser 2. They discontinued this particular unit, but there's some other ones available. So we initiated guidance, and then we covered it with a bag. And I told the operators, I had my technicians drive the pastures. We had 4 pastures ranging from 6 to 10 acres. I said drive on 30-foot centers and go 8 miles an hour. So then we did the same thing, except we allowed them to use the GPS guidance. And this is what we found. When we looked at 2019, this was operator number 1. When he did not have guidance, his tendency was not to have skips. So he had a 50% overlap. With no guidance. That was reduced to 3% when he used guidance. Same general trend, except our driver was a little bit better in 2021, and she had a 21% overlap, and without guidance, and with guidance, it reduced it to about 3.5%. On average, we had about a 35% overlap, and it's important to point this out because the tendency of the operators were to not have skips, which means that they were getting closer together than they should have, resulting in overlaps. And that was reduced to 3.5% when they used guidance. So this is just a little bit on the economics of buying one of these small portable GPS units. We paid about $1,500 for the unit used in this study. And this is what I call agroeconomics. So I'm not an economist, I'm just an agronomist. And I kind of tried to put some numbers with how long it would take to recover the cost of these small units. And if we look at something like overseeding clover, it's going to cost us about $30 an acre. And we had 21% overlap or 20% overlap for this particular example. If we overseeded 250 acres of pasture, our seed savings for not overlapping would be enough to recover the cost of that unit in about 250 acres. Now, if we're using this unit for other things like no-tilling, where we can get lost in pastures when we're no-tilling, fertilizing, liming, spraying, anything that we need to do in a pattern in a pasture, we can reduce or recover the cost of this unit much more quickly. I want to share one other study with you that we did, and a couple years ago we purchased a frost seeder from Europe called an APV frost seeder. It's a couple unique things. It's really easy to calibrate. Once you use one of these, you won't want to go back to a herd seeder, I promise you. This fan unit folds down out of the way and allows you to easily catch the seed. It's controlled with electronically with a control box that's mounted up with the operator. So in pastures, we often have rough and uneven terrain that goes up and down, and there's obstacles like rock outcrops and sinkholes and old stumps and ditches and so forth, and that's constantly causing us to slow down and speed up. And when we do that, this results in either over-applying or under-applying seed in those pastures. One of the neat things about this little seeder is that it has a variable seeding rate mechanism that allows the seeding rate to be adjusted in real time as the ground speed changes. So if I slow down or speed up, this seeder automatically adjusts the amount of seed that it's putting out. So one of the questions that we had was, how well does this actually work? So we put a little study together, and we had two treatments. We had a constant seeding rate, and we can set that seeder to put out the same amount of seed regardless of our speed, or we had a variable seeding rate that changed as our ground speed changed. And then we calibrated the seeder for 6 miles an hour. Then I either drove 3 or 9. And we did the same thing with variable seeding rate, calibrated for 6, and drove 3 or 9 miles, 3, 6, and 9 miles an hour. And we calibrated it for 10 pounds of seed per acre. We put 15 pounds of seed in the seeder, so we weighed the seed as we put it in the seeder. Then we drove a 1,000-foot course, and we weighed the remaining seed. And that allowed us to very accurately calculate the actual seeding rate. And this was the results. If I look, and this is seeding rate here, this black line is our target seeding rate of 10 pounds per acre. And then this first half of the graph is when the variable seeding rate mechanism was engaged on this seeder. And what we found was whether we slowed down to 3 miles an hour or sped up to 9 miles an hour, we were always within 10% of our targeted seeding rate. And that's worked amazingly well. I did not anticipate it working this well. Now, when we had the constant seeding rate, so the seeding rate didn't vary as we sped up and slowed down. When we slowed down to 3 miles an hour, we doubled our seeding rate. And when we sped up to 9 miles an hour, we got about a third lower seeding rate than our optimum seeding rate. So this seeder worked amazingly well at adjusting the seeding rate on the fly. Okay, let's move on and look at an example where we have moderate damage in that pasture. So in this example, we have 50 to 60% soil disturbance and moderate to deep pugging. And that's going to put us right down here and kind of in this moderate disturbance range. So once we get in and quantify this disturbance, then we can make a plan based on that flow chart of what we do. And for moderate damage, we're going to, again, make sure our soil fertility is in the right spot. And then we're going to overseed with a grass legume mixture. And for us, 15 to 25 pounds of tall fescue or 8 to 12 pounds of orchard grass, or a combination of the two, would work fine. And then we can put a little bit of clover in, 6 to 8 pounds of red clover, a pound or two of ladino clover. And that's going to be a pretty good mixture for overseeding those moderate disturbance areas. Ideally, we would do it with a no-till drill, right? Because what we want to do is avoid damaging any plants that are left in that pasture. So drilling it in with a no-till drill would be the best. Sometimes we'll have to do a little bit of light tillage to kind of smooth it out before we can drill it in. And if we have to do that, sometimes we'll just broadcast the seed on and then call to pack it in. So I just want to mention no-till drill, and using a no-till drill takes a little more effort and attention to detail, but we can get pretty good results because we're actually putting that seed in contact with the soil. When we just broadcast that seed on, we're counting on that freezing and thawing to incorporate that seed into the soil. This can be successful in the spring or the fall. So the first thing we want to do is suppress that sod and reduce residue. We want a light amount of residue on that soil surface. If we have heavy residue, it interferes with seed placement in the soil. We want to calibrate the drill prior to seeding. And we have a real nice drill calibration publication. And it's kind of a universal method that works over any type of drill. So it works on a hay buster or a John Deere or a Great Plains. You can reach it by scanning this QR code or just Googling grain drill calibration UKY. And what makes this method so easy is that I've already done the math for you. And if you look at this chart down here on the bottom, here we have our seeding rate, our desired seeding rate in pounds per acre. So it doesn't matter what kind of seed you have. It just you just need to know how many pounds of seed that you want to put out per acre. In the first column, we have our distance between disc openers. So most drills will be 7.5 inches, but it could be 6 or 8 inches, depending on the drill type. And we kind of come together with two arrows from our desired seeding rate and our disc opener spacing, and that tells us how many grams of seed that we need to catch for one seed tube in 150 feet. So for this example, we used 120 pounds of seed, and that would be a seeding rate for something like a small grain. We have a really nice drill calibration video that's available online. It's about 10 or 15 minutes, and it's definitely worth your time watching it. It kind of takes you through each one of these steps on seed drill calibration. Okay, after we get the drill calibrated, we need to check and recheck our seeding depth. Don't take somebody's word for it. The seeding depth should never be deeper than 1/2 inch. A general rule is if you can't see a little bit of seed beside that drill slit, you're probably going too deep with that seed. So check and recheck your seeding depth. This is Jessica, James, and Hunter Adams, and they were my interns when I first came to the research station in the summer of 2019. And they're checking and rechecking the seeding depth. And then we want to control post-seeding competition. And this is really important step and one that's often left out. And when we don't control that competition from that existing sod, that sod will grow up around those seedlings that are trying to develop and get an established root system, and often outcompete those for light, and that seedling will die. So one of our biggest reasons for stand failures with frost seeding is not controlling this post-seeding competition. So one way to do that is after we frost seed that clover on the pasture, leave the animals in that paddock and feed a little bit of hay in there, and they'll pick around and keep that sod suppressed as it starts to grow in early spring. Just to think a little bit outside the box, I want to talk just a little bit about using crabgrass. And we can use crabgrass in combination with red clover and annual ryegrass to overseed just moderately and drastically disturbed areas. And what we do is we would seed this in late winter or early spring. The annual ryegrass would give us some good initial growth when conditions are cooler. And as it kind of plays out as we get into June and temperatures get warmer, the crabgrass comes on and provides some good summer grazing and ground cover that helps exclude weeds from the system. So we want to smooth the area up with a little bit of light tillage. Broadcast that seed on. 3 to 5 pounds of uncoated crabgrass, or if you're using coated crabgrass, which has about a 50% seed coating by weight, we want to double that rate to around 6 to 10 pounds. If we're mixing annual ryegrass in and you have a pretty good stocking rate or a large number of animals, then somewhere between 15 and 25 pounds of annual ryegrass would be good to mix in. If we have a lower stocking rate and not as many animals, then lower that somewhere around 15 pounds of annual ryegrass. And then drag it or cultipack it in to get good soil to seed contact so that it germinates and comes up in a timely manner. And that's going to provide us grazing or haying in both the spring and the summer. One of the nice things about crabgrass compared to our more traditional summer annuals is that if you don't have a lot of animals, crabgrass is going to get about 3 foot tall, but something like a sorghum Sudan grass that's not actively grazed or a pearl millet could get 6 or 8 or 10 feet tall if it gets away from us in the summer months. It's easier to manage grazing on this crabgrass combination than it would be a sorghum Sudan grass. This is just an example of a red clover crabgrass stand at the research station in Princeton. This occurred because we had a pretty severe crabgrass infestation in our red clover variety trial, but it's actually a really nice combination of red clover and crabgrass. These are some steers grazing crabgrass at the research station in Princeton, and we of course used polywire to kind of limit access to some areas of the pasture and get a little bit better forage utilization. Crabgrass is actually really high in forage quality, and if you're in a finishing system or a system where you require a little higher nutritional plane, such as heifer development, crabgrass can be a really good choice for that. Okay, let's talk about the last category, and that's severe and very severe damage. And that's when we have nearly 100% soil disturbance and deep pugging. And that's going to put us down here in this part of the table where we have severe and very severe damage in that pasture. So again, we want to make sure our soil fertility is in good shape. We want to reestablish the cool season forage base. The question is do we try to do it in the spring, or do we wait until that fall to establish it? And if we wait until the fall, what do we do in the meantime? And often when we try to establish it in the spring, we will have a stand failure because we have a lot of competition from summer annual weeds, spiny amaranth, cockleburr, goosegrass, foxtails, and so on. So my thought is the best option is to go in the spring with the summer annual and go ahead and smooth those areas up in late spring, and then get the summer annual established when the soil temperature is at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Get a good stand of summer annual that excludes a lot of that weed pressure, and come back in and establish that cold season grass that fall. So I want to talk a little bit about using summer annuals as a smother crop, and probably our best summer annual for a smother crop that helps exclude weeds from that stand would be a sorghum Sudan grass. It just has very rapid germination, emergence, and formation of a canopy, and that's what you want. You want that desired forage species to close that canopy up and exclude or keep weeds from germinating in that stand. So we're going to have some type of moderate tillage in this system to get the pastures leveled back out. We're going to either drill or broadcast that summer annual seed on. If we broadcast it, then we need to come back and either work it in or cultipack it. And if we use sorghum Sudan grass, we want to be in that seeding range of around 25 to 50 pounds. And the little bit heavier seeding rates will help to exclude more weeds and get an earlier stand. And then we want to graze it or hay it during the summer months, and then come back with a non-selective herbicide in late summer, early fall, apply that, and then no-till in our perennial cool season grass mix. And then that following spring, we want to use that new stand of cool season grasses very gingerly. So we can use it, but we don't want to overgraze it. Okay, I want to just kind of finish up and tell you a little bit about some summer annual demonstrations we did in 2018 when I first came to Kentucky. And we did these at 6 locations across western Kentucky. And we had 4 treatments. We had a BMR sorghum Sudan grass, a pearl millet, a forage soybean, and Sudan grass millet soybean mixture. The soybeans really struggled in these demonstrations because there was just so much summer annual weed competition without any herbicide application. And that was a real challenge for the soybeans, who were a little bit slower getting started and forming a canopy. On this particular farm, the producer and extension agent decided to release the soybean by spraying a glyphosate application on this, since it was a Roundup Ready soybean. And that worked pretty well. A lot of times we get native crabgrass filling in the gaps in these soybean stands, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because crabgrass can be a pretty good forage. We did one location, we had a crabgrass annual Lespedeza mixture that was pretty nice. Seeding depth matters. Let me tell you about this picture. So in the middle of the picture, we've got one strip of pearl millet. And in what happened is that the extension agent decided that this seed was not going deep enough when he was seeding this pearl millet. So he lowered the drill, and when he did that, he put the small seed pearl millet too deep in the soil. And when he did that, he did not get a stand. So he only got a stand on the first drill pass in this particular example. So seeding depth is really important. For small seeded forages, we need to be in that 1/2 inch range. For sorghum Sudan, we can go down to 1 inch or so. The Sudan grass, established really quickly in these demonstrations, formed a canopy that excluded a lot of weed pressure that we saw in other plots. And we did use a BMR variety, which has increased digestibility and lower levels of lignin in these studies. So this is just an example. This is a Sudan grass, and then this was the mix of millet, Sudan grass, and soybeans. And we just did not get a good stand with that mixture. And because we didn't get a good stand, then we got a lot of weeds, summer annual weeds in these pastures. And we sampled the plots, and what we found was that these summer annuals could be quite productive. So when we looked at pearl millet and sorghum Sudan grass, we're looking at around 5,000 pounds of dry matter per acre. The soybean was much less. It just had a lot of weed competition. And then we had a mixture of pearl millet and sorghum Sudan and forage soybean. And it kind of did better than just the soybean, but not quite as good as sorghum Sudan grass and pearl millet alone. And that's all I've got. So I would encourage you to take a look at our publication. We have a publication that's called Reclaiming Drastically Disturbed Hay Feeding Areas. And that's a really good publication that goes over some of these things that we talked about. But also encourage you to call your local extension agent and get them involved. They know your farm. They know the area. They know what's going to work and what's not going to work. And if they have any questions, then they can get a hold of me. So with that, thank you for your attention. I hope you have a great spring and a productive summer.